Traveling the Old West wasn't the bold adventure Hollywood made it out to be. Was a slow, exhausting, and often deadly ordeal. In this video, we uncover 13 miserable truths about traveling the Old West, revealing what pioneers, settlers, and wagon train families truly endured as they pushed westward in search of land, gold, and opportunity. From deadly diseases and spoiled food to brutal weather, broken wagons, and crushing loneliness, life on the trail tested the human body and spirit in ways few modern travelers could imagine. Every mile came with danger, and every decision could mean the difference between survival and an unmarked grave along the trail. You'll learn how families lived for months in cramped wagons, why clean water was so hard to find, how simple accidents turned fatal, and why turning back was rarely an option once the journey began. These stories expose the harsh reality behind one of the most romanticized periods in American history. Whether you're fascinated by frontier life, pioneer history, or the untold struggles of everyday people, this video sheds light on the real cost of westward expansion, the pain, fear, and sacrifice that shaped a nation. The first, and most inescapable truth, was that death was always close. While Hollywood epics focused on dramatic shootouts, the reality was far more grim and mundane. It wasn't a bandit's bullet that travelers feared most, but an invisible enemy that stalked every wagon train. Disease was the single greatest killer on the trail, claiming far more lives than gunfights or conflicts combined. Cholera, in particular, was a terrifying scourge, spreading like wildfire along the contaminated riverbanks and crowded campsites of the major wagon routes. An outbreak could decimate a party in days, turning a hopeful journey into a rolling funeral procession. Even a seemingly minor injury could escalate into a fatal ordeal. A simple cut from a tool or a scrape from a fall could quickly become infected in the unsanitary conditions, leading to blood poisoning and a slow, agonizing death. The constant presence of mortality was etched into the landscape itself. Graves, often hastily dug and marked with a simple wooden cross or a pile of stones, lined the Oregon and California trails. These solemn markers served as a chilling and constant reminder to every passing traveler that they could be next. For many, the journey west ended not with a view of a golden sunset over the Pacific, but in a lonely, unmarked grave, thousands of miles from home. The second miserable truth was that food was bland, limited, and often spoiled. The romantic image of pioneers gathered around a crackling campfire, enjoying a hearty stew, is a comforting fiction. The reality of trail cuisine was a monotonous and often stomach-turning affair. For months on end, the diet consisted of little more than dried beans, hardtack, a tooth-breakingly hard biscuit, and salted or cured meat, typically bacon. These staples were chosen for their longevity, not their flavor or nutritional value. Any fresh food, like vegetables or eggs, was a rare luxury that disappeared within the first few weeks of the journey. As the weeks turned into months, food supplies began to dwindle and spoil. It was common for families to discover their precious sacks of flour were riddled with mold or infested with weevils. Bacon, stored improperly in the summer heat, often turned rancid, yet it was frequently cooked and eaten anyway because the alternative was starvation. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing ache that shadowed every step of the journey. The daily struggle was not just about making miles, but about finding enough calories to keep moving, forcing families to consume food that, in any other circumstance, would have been considered inedible. Just as critical as food, and often harder to secure, was clean water, our third miserable truth. The great rivers that served as the highways of the West, like the Platte and the Arkansas, were far from pristine. These waterways were essentially open sewers, contaminated by the waste of thousands of animals and humans traveling ahead of them. Herds of buffalo often fouled the water, and the carcasses of dead oxen that had collapsed from exhaustion were frequently left to rot along the riverbanks, poisoning the supply for miles downstream. Drinking this contaminated water was a gamble that often led to severe and debilitating illnesses like dysentery and typhoid fever, which could quickly incapacitate an entire family. When the trails diverged from the main rivers, the search for water became a desperate, all-consuming task. Water shortages forced pioneers into making agonizing decisions, such as unhitching their precious livestock and leaving them to die, or drinking from stagnant, alkali pools that they knew could be poisonous. The thirst was described by many as a form of torture, a constant, rasping torment under the blazing sun. The absence of clean, safe water was one of the most punishing and dangerous aspects of the entire journey. Adding to these physical hardships was the fact that traveling was painfully slow. The fourth truth of the trail is that it was an exercise in extreme patience and endurance. The iconic canvas-topped prairie schooners moved at a crawl, their heavy wooden wheels grinding through mud, sand, and rock. On a good day, with flat terrain and fair weather, a wagon train might cover 15 miles. On a bad day, struggling through mountains or fording a river, they might make only 1 or 2. A journey of 2,000 miles could take up to 6 months, an unimaginable length of time spent in constant motion and uncertainty. These delays weren't just frustrating. They could be fatal. A late start or a series of setbacks could mean missing the crucial window to cross the Sierra Nevada or Rocky Mountains before the first snows, trapping the party for the winter, as tragically happened to the infamous Donner Party. This slow pace left travelers exposed to our fifth miserable truth: the brutal and extreme weather. Pioneers were at the complete mercy of the elements. The relentless summer sun on the open plains was a formidable enemy, causing severe dehydration, heat stroke, and blistering sunburns. There was no shade, no escape. Then, without warning, the weather could turn. Vicious thunderstorms could materialize in minutes, unleashing torrential rain and hail that could stampede cattle, flood campsites, and destroy precious supplies. As they climbed into higher elevations, the threat shifted to freezing cold. Sudden blizzards could trap a wagon train in deep snow, with temperatures plummeting far below zero. These storms could last for days, and for those caught unprepared, it was a death sentence. When illness or injury struck, there was little hope for relief, which brings us to the sixth miserable truth. Medical care was almost non-existent. There were very few trained doctors who made the journey west, and those who did had limited supplies and an even more limited understanding of modern medicine. Most medical treatment relied on folk remedies, superstition, and pure guesswork. A bottle of laudanum, a potent opium tincture, was a common cure-all, used for everything from calming a fussy baby to treating cholera. In the case of a severe injury like a crushed limb or a gunshot wound, the only available option was often amputation. These gruesome procedures were performed without anesthesia, using a simple saw and a bottle of whiskey for the pain, with a high risk of fatal infection afterward. The need for such drastic measures was tragically common, as our seventh truth reveals. Accidents were frequent and often deadly. The wagon itself, the pioneer's home and vessel of hope, was a constant source of danger. People, especially men trying to manage the oxen, were frequently crushed by the heavy iron-rimmed wheels if they stumbled and fell. Children, restless from the long days, sometimes fell from the moving wagons and were run over before the driver could react. River crossings were another major point of peril. A sudden current, a hidden sandbar, or a spooked animal could capsize a wagon, throwing its occupants into the rushing water and causing them to drown, often tangled in their heavy clothing. This constant danger, combined with the physical demands of the trail, led to our eighth miserable truth: a state of constant, bone-deep exhaustion. The image of a family riding comfortably inside their wagon is a myth. To spare the draft animals, nearly everyone who was able-bodied walked from sunrise to sunset. Pioneers trudged alongside their wagons, covering mile after dusty mile on foot. The days were long, and the labor was unceasing, herding livestock, gathering fuel, cooking, and making repairs. There was very little time allowed for rest. Even sleep offered little respite, as it was often interrupted by the need to stand guard against predators or potential threats, leaving travelers in a perpetual state of fatigue that dulled the senses and weakened the spirit. In these grueling conditions, personal hygiene was nearly impossible. Our ninth miserable truth: the opportunity to bathe was a rare luxury that could be weeks or even months apart. Water, when found, was too precious to be used for washing and was prioritized for drinking and cooking. As a result, travelers were covered in a permanent layer of dust, sweat, and grime. Clothing was worn for weeks on end without being washed, becoming stiff with dirt. These unsanitary conditions were a breeding ground for parasites. Lice, fleas, and other pests were widespread, causing constant itching, discomfort, and skin infections. The stench within a crowded wagon train on a hot day was, by all accounts, overwhelming beyond the physical suffering. The journey inflicted deep psychological wounds, leading to our 10th miserable truth: loneliness and severe mental strain were rampant. When pioneers left their homes in the East, they were often saying goodbye to their families and communities forever. The trail was an isolating experience, severing them from everything they had ever known. This profound sense of separation, combined with the daily hardships and constant fear, led many to suffer from deep depression and despair. Diaries from the period are filled with entries expressing profound homesickness and a sense of hopelessness. Some travelers suffered complete emotional breakdowns, unable to cope with the relentless pressure. A major source of this mental strain was our 11th truth: The fear of conflict with Native Americans, which was constant and often misunderstood. Stories of violent attacks, amplified by sensationalist reports back east, created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety. Every traveler was on high alert, and the fear of an ambush was a constant companion. While violent conflicts did occur, the vast majority of encounters between pioneers and native tribes were tense but peaceful negotiations, often centered around trade or passage fees. However, misinformation and prejudice fueled panic, leading to tragic misunderstandings and unnecessary violence on both sides. For the pioneers, the psychological stress of this perceived threat was as draining as any physical hardship. Even if a traveler survived disease, starvation, and conflict, their journey could be cut short by a 12th truth: equipment frequently failed. The covered wagon was a marvel of simple engineering, but it was not indestructible. Under the immense strain of crossing rugged terrain, wagon wheels broke, axles snapped, and canvas covers tore. A broken part in the middle of the prairie was a catastrophe. Replacement parts were nearly impossible to find, and a traveler might have to abandon their wagon and most of their belongings, attempting to continue on foot or hoping to find space with another family. A single broken piece of gear could spell the end of the dream, turning a hopeful settler into a destitute refugee on the trail. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most terrible truth of all. There was no turning back. Once a family had invested their life savings into outfitting a wagon and had traveled several hundred miles into the wilderness, retreat was not a viable option. Turning back meant admitting financial ruin and facing a grueling journey home with no resources. For many, the point of no return came quickly. They were committed. This grim reality forced countless pioneers to push forward, even when faced with what seemed like certain death. They pressed on through blizzards, across deserts, and past the graves of those who had gone before, driven by the desperate knowledge that the only way out was forward. Watch until the end to discover which hardship travelers feared more than bandits and gunfights. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more forgotten history, hidden truths, and untold stories from the past.